Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. We're just going to get right into it with the next chapter of Phantom of the Opera. Chapter 5, The Enchanted Violin. Christine Daae, owing to intrigues to which I will return later, did not immediately continue her triumph at the opera. After the famous gala night, she sung once at the Duchess de Zurich's, but this was the last occasion on which she was heard in private. She refused, without plausible excuse, to appear at a charity concert, to which she had promised her assistance. She acted throughout as though she was no longer the mistress of her own destiny, and as though she feared a fresh triumph. She knew the Count de Chagny, to please his brother, had done his best on her behalf with Monsieur Richard, and she wrote to thank him and also to ask him to cease speaking in her favor. Her reason for this curious attitude was never known. Some pretended that it was due to overweening pride, others spoke of her heavenly modesty. But people on stage are not so modest as all that, and I think that I shall not be far from the truth if I ascribe her action simply to fear. Yes, I believe that Christine Daae was frightened by what had happened to her. I have a letter of Christine's, it forms part of the Persian's collection, relating to this period, which suggests a feeling of absolute dismay. "I don't know myself when I sing," writes the poor child. She showed herself nowhere, and the Viscount de Chagny tried in vain to meet her. He wrote to her, asking to call upon her, but despaired of receiving a reply, when one morning she sent him the following note. "Monsieur, I have not forgotten the little boy who went into the sea to rescue my scarf. I feel that I must write you today, when I am going to Paros, in fulfillment of a sacred duty. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the death of my poor father, who you knew and who was very fond of you. He's buried there with his violin, in the graveyard of the little church, at the bottom of the slope where we used to play as children, beside the road where, when we were a little bigger, we said good-bye for the last time." The Viscount de Chagny hurriedly consulted a railway guide, dressed as quickly as he could, wrote a few lines for his valet to take to his brother, and jumped into a cab which brought him to the Gare Montparnasse, just in time to miss the morning train. He spent a dismal day in town, and didn't recover his spirits until the evening, when he was seated in his compartment in the Brittany Express. He read Christine's note over and over again, smelling its perfume, recalling the sweet pictures of his childhood, and spent the rest of that tedious night journey in feverish dreams that began and ended with Christine Daae. Day was breaking when he alighted at Lannion. He hurried the diligence for the Paros-Guirec. He was the only passenger, and he questioned the driver, and learned that on the evening of the previous day, a young lady who looked like a Parisian had gone to Paros, and put up at the inn known as the Setting Sun. The nearer he drew to her, the more fondly he remembered the story of the little Swedish singer. Most of the details are still unknown to the public. There was once, in a little market town not far from Uppsala, a peasant who lived there with his family, digging the earth during the week and singing in the choir on Sundays. The peasant had a little daughter, to whom he taught the musical alphabet before she knew how to read. Daae's father was a great musician, perhaps without knowing it. Not a fiddler throughout the length and breadth of Scandinavia played as he did. His reputation was widespread, and he was always invited to set the couples dancing at weddings and other festivals. His wife died when Christine was entering her 6th year. Then the father, who cared only for his daughter and his music, sold his patch of ground and went to Uppsala in search of fame and fortune, but he found nothing but poverty. He returned to the country, wandering from fair to fair, strumming his Scandinavian melodies, while his child, who never left his side, listened to him in ecstasy or sang to his playing. One day at Limji Fair, man, these French names just really get to me. Lijimbi? Yeah, that's probably how I say that. One day at Lijimbi Fair, Professor Valerius heard them and took them to Gothenburg. He maintained that the father was the first violinist in the world, and that the daughter had the makings of a great artist. Her education and instruction were provided for, and she made rapid progress, and charmed everyone with her prettiness, her grace of manner, and her genuine eagerness to please. When Valerius and his wife went to settle in France, they took Daae and Christine with them. Mamma Valerius treated Christine as her daughter, and as for Day, he began to pine away with homesickness. He never went out of doors in Paris, but lived in a sort of dream which he kept up with his violin. For hours at a time he remained locked up in his bedroom with his daughter, fiddling and singing very, very softly. Sometimes Mamma Valerius would come and listen behind the door, wipe away a tear, and go downstairs again on tiptoe, sighing for her Scandinavian skies. Day seemed not to recover his strength until the summer, when the whole family went to stay at MASQUERADE, in a faraway corner of Brittany, where the sea was of the same color in his own country. Often he would play his saddest tunes on the beach, and pretend that the sea stopped its roaring to listen to them. And then he induced Mamma Valerius to indulge a strange whim of his. At the time of the pardons, or Breton pilgrimages, the village festival and dances, he went off with his fiddle, as in the old days, and was allowed to take his daughter with him for a week. They gave the smallest hamlets music to last them for a year, and slept at night in a barn, refusing a bed at the inn, and they lay so close together on the straw, as when they were so poor in Sweden. At the same time they were very neatly dressed, made no collection, refused the halfpence offered them, and the people around couldn't understand the conduct of this rustic fiddler, who tramped the roads with that pretty child who sang like an angel from heaven. They followed them from village to village. One day a little boy, who was out with his governess, made her take a longer walk than he intended, for he couldn't tear himself from the little girl whose pure, sweet voice seemed to bind him to her. They came to the shore of an inlet which is still called Trestero, but which now I believe harbors a casino or something of that sort. At that time there was nothing but sky and sea and a stretch of golden beach. Only there was also a high wind which blew Christine's scarf out to sea. Christine gave a cry and put out her arms, but the scarf was already far on the waves. And then she heard a voice say, "It's all right, I'll go and fetch your scarf out of the sea." And she saw a little boy running fast, in spite of the outcries and the indignant protests of the worthy lady. The little boy ran into the sea, dressed as he was, and brought her back her scarf. Boy and scarf were both soaked through, and the lady in black made a great fuss, but Christine laughed merrily and kissed the little boy, who was none other than the Viscount Raoul de Chauny, staying at Lannion with his aunt. During the season they saw each other and played together almost every day. At the aunt's request, seconded by Professor Valerius, Day consented to give the young Viscount some violin lessons. In this way Raoul learned to love the same airs that had charmed Christine's childhood. They also both had the same calm and dreamy little cast of mind. They delighted in stories and old Breton legends, and their favorite sport was to go and ask for them at the cottage doors like beggars. "Ma'am, or kind gentleman, have you a little story to tell us, please?" And it seldom happened that they didn't have one given them, for nearly every old Breton grandmother has at least once in her life seen the Corrigans dance by moonlight on the heather. But the great treat was in the twilight, in the great silence of the evening, after the sun had set in the sea, when Day came and sat down by them on the roadside, and in a low voice, as though fearing lest he should frighten the ghosts whom he evoked, told them the legends of the land of the north, and the moment he stopped the children would ask for more. There was one story that began, a king sat in a little boat on one of those deep still lakes that open like a bright eye, in the midst of the Norwegian mountains. And another, little Lot, thought of everything and nothing. Her hair was golden as the sun's ray, and her soul as clear and blue as her eyes. She wheedled her mother, was kind to her doll, took great care of her frock and her little red shoes and her fiddle, but most of all loved when she went to sleep, to hear the angel of music. While the old man told this story, Raoul looked at Christine's blue eyes and golden hair, and Christine thought that Lot was very lucky to hear the angel of music when she went to sleep. The angel of music played a part in all of the father's tales, and he maintained that every great musician, every great artist, received a visit from the angel at least once in his life. Sometimes the angel leans over their cradle, as happened to Lot. That's how there are little prodigies that play the fiddle at 6 better than men at 50, which you must admit is very wonderful. Sometimes the angel comes much later because the children are naughty and won't learn their lessons or practice their scales. And sometimes he doesn't come at all because the children have a bad heart or a bad conscience. No one ever sees the angel, but he's heard by those who are meant to hear him. He often comes when they least expect him, when they are sad and disheartened. Then their ears suddenly perceive celestial harmonies, a divine voice which they remember all their lives. Persons who are visited by the angel quiver with a thrill unknown to the rest of mankind, and they cannot touch an instrument or open their mouths to sing without producing sounds that put all other human sounds to shame. Then people who do not know that the angel has visited those persons say that they have genius. Little Christine asked her father if he had heard the angel of music, but he shook his head sadly, and then his eyes lit up as he said, "You will hear him one day, my child. When I'm in heaven, I'll send him to you." You see, the father was beginning to cough at that time. And 3 years later, Raoul and Christine met again at Paros. Professor Valerius was dead, but his widow remained in France with Papa Day and his daughter, who continued to play the violin and sing, wrapping in their dream of harmony their kind patroness, who seemed henceforth to live on music alone. The young man, as he now was, had come to Paris on the chance of finding them, and went straight to the house in which they used to stay. He first saw the old man, and then Christine entered, carrying the tea-tray. She flushed at the sight of Raoul, who went up to her and kissed her. She asked him a few questions, performed her duties as hostess prettily, and took up the tray again and left the room. Then she ran into the garden and took refuge on a bench, prey to feelings that stirred in her young heart for the first time. Raoul followed her, and they talked till the evening very shyly. They were quite changed, cautious as two diplomatists, and told each other things that had nothing to do with their budding sentiments. When they took leave of each other by the roadside, Raoul pressed a kiss on Christine's trembling hand, and said, "Mademoiselle, I shall never forget you." And he went away regretting his words, for he knew that Christine could not be the wife of the Viscount de Charnay. As for Christine, she tried not to think of him, and devoted herself wholly to her art. She made wonderful progress, and those who heard her prophesied that she'd be the greatest singer in the world. Meanwhile her father died, and suddenly she seemed to have lost with him her voice, her soul, her genius. She retained just, but only just, enough of this to enter the conservatory, where she didn't distinguish herself at all, attending the classes without enthusiasm, and taking a prize only to please old Mamma Valerius, with whom she continued to live. The first time that Raoul saw Christine at the opera, he was charmed by the girl's beauty and by the sweet images of the past which it evoked, but was rather surprised at the negative side of her art. He returned to listen to her and followed her in the wings. He waited for her behind a Jacob's ladder and tried to attract her attention. More than once he walked after her to the door of her box, but she didn't see him. She seemed, for that matter, to see nobody. She was all indifference. Raoul suffered at this, for she was very beautiful, and he was shy and dared not confess his love, even to himself. And then came the lightning flash of the gala performance, the heavens torn asunder, and an angel's voice heard upon earth for the delight of mankind and the utter capture of his heart. And then there was that man's voice behind the door. "You must love me," and no one in that room. Why did she laugh when he reminded her of the incident of the scarf? Why didn't she recognize him? And why had she written to him? Paris was reached at last, and Raoul walked into the smoky sitting-room of the setting sun, and at once saw Christine standing before him, smiling and showing no astonishment. "So you have come. I felt that I should find you here when I came back from Mass. Someone told me so at the church." "Who?" asked Raoul, taking her little hand in his. "Why, my poor father, who's dead." There was a silence, and then Raoul asked, "Did your father tell you that I love you, Christine, and that I cannot live without you?" At this Christine blushed to the eyes and turned away her head, and in a trembling voice she said, "Me? You're dreaming, my friend." And she burst out laughing to put herself in countenance. "Don't laugh, Christine, I'm quite serious," answered Raoul, and she replied gravely, I didn't make you come to tell me such things as that." "You made me come, Christine. You knew that your letter would not leave me indignant, and that I should hasten to Paros. How can you have thought that if you did not think I loved you?" "I thought you would remember our games here as children, in which my father so often joined. I really don't know what I thought. Perhaps I was wrong to write to you. This anniversary and your sudden appearance in my room at the opera, the other evening, it reminded me of the time long past that made me write to you as the little girl I then was." There was something in Christine's attitude that seemed to Raoul not natural. He didn't feel any hostility in her, far from it. The distressed affection shining in her eyes told him that, but why was this affection distressed? That was what he wished to know, and what was irritating him. "When you saw me in your dressing room, was that the first time you noticed me, Christine?" She found herself incapable of lying. "No, I'd seen you several times in your brother's box, and also on the stage." "I thought so," said Raoul, compressing his lips. "But then why, when you saw me in your room at your feet, reminding you that I'd rescued your scarf from the sea, why did you answer as though you didn't know me? And also, why did you laugh?" The tone of these questions was so rough that Christine stared at Raoul without replying. The young man himself was aghast at the sudden quarrel which he dared to raise at the very moment when he had resolved to speak words of gentleness, love, and submission to Christine. A husband, a lover with all rights, would talk no differently to a wife, a mistress who had offended him. But he'd gone too far and saw no other way out of the ridiculous position than to behave odiously. You don't answer?" he said angrily, unhappily. "Well, I will answer for you. It's because there was someone in the room who was in your way, Christine. Someone you didn't wish to know that you could be interested in anyone else." "If anyone was in my way, my friend," Christine broke in coldly, "if anyone was in my way, that evening it was yourself, since I told you to leave the room." "Yes, so that you might remain with the other." "What are you saying, monsieur? And to what other do you refer?" "To the man whom you said I sing only for you. Tonight I give you my soul, and I am dead." Christine seized Raoul's arm and clutched it with a strength which no one would have suspected in so frail a creature. "Then you were listening behind the door?" "Yes, because I love you, everything, and I heard everything." "You heard what?" And the young girl, becoming strangely calm, released Raoul's arm. "He said to you, 'Christine, you must love me.'" And at these words a deathly pallor spread over Christine's face. Dark rings formed round her eyes, and she staggered and seemed on the point of swooning. Raoul darted forward with his arms outstretched, but Christine had overcome her passing faintness and said, in a low voice, Go on, tell me everything you've heard." At a loss to understand, Raoul answered, I heard him reply, when you said you'd given him your soul. Your soul is a beautiful thing, child, and I thank you. No emperor received ever so fair a gift. The angels wept tonight." And Christine carried her hand to her heart, a prey to indescribable emotion. Her eyes stared before her like a madwoman's, and Raoul was terror-stricken. But suddenly Christine's eyes moistened, and two great tears trickled like two pearls down her ivory cheeks. "Christine." "Raoul." The young man tried to take her in his arms, but she escaped and fled in great disorder. While Christine remained locked in her room, Raoul was at his wit's end what to do. He refused to breakfast. He refused to breakfast. He was terribly concerned and bitterly grieved to see the hours which he had hoped to find so sweet slip past without the presence of the young Swedish girl. Why did she not come to roam with him through the country where they had so many memories in common? He heard that she had had a mass said that morning for the repose of her father's soul, and spent a long time praying in the little church, and on the fiddler's tomb. And then, as she seemed to have nothing more to do at Paros, and was in fact doing nothing there, why didn't she go back to Paris at once? Raoul walked away dejectedly to the graveyard in which the church stood, and was indeed alone among the tombs, reading the inscriptions. But when he turned behind the apse, he was suddenly struck by the dazzling note of flowers that straggled over the white ground. They were marvelous red roses that had blossomed in the morning, in the snow, giving a glimpse of life among the dead, for the death that was all around him. It also, like the flowers, issued from the ground, which had flung back a number of its corpses. Skeletons and skulls by the hundred were heaped against the wall of the church, held in position by a wire that left the whole gruesome stack visible. Dead men's bones arranged in rows like bricks to form the first course upon which the walls of the sacristy had been built. The door of the sacristy opened in the middle of that bony structure, as is often seen in old Breton churches. Raoul said a prayer for Day, and then, painfully impressed by all those eternal smiles on the mouths of the skulls, he climbed the slope and sat down on the edge of the heath overlooking the sea. The wind fell with the evening, and Raoul was surrounded by icy darkness, but he didn't feel the cold. It was here, he remembered, that he used to come with little Christine to see the Corrigans dance at the rising of the moon. He'd never seen any, though his eyes were good, whereas Christine, who was a little short-sighted, pretended that she had seen many. He smiled at the thought, and then suddenly gave a start. A voice behind him said, "Do you think the Corrigans will come this evening?" It was Christine. He tried to speak, and she put her gloved hand on his mouth. "Listen, Raoul. I have decided to tell you something serious, very serious. Do you remember the legend of the Angel of Music?" I do indeed. I believe it was here that your father first told it to us." "And it was here they said, 'When I'm in heaven, my child, I'll send them to you.' Well, Raoul, my father is in heaven, and I have been visited by the Angel of Music."
"I have no doubt of it," replied the young man gravely, for it seemed to him that his friend, in obedience to a pious thought, was connecting the memory of her father with the brilliancy of her last triumph.
Christine appeared astonished at the Viscount de Chaugnay's coolness. How do you understand it?" she asked, bringing her pale face so close to his that he might have thought that Christine was going to give him a kiss, but she only wanted to read his eyes in spite of the dark.
"I understand that no human being can sing as you sang the other evening without the intervention of some miracle. No professor on the earth can teach you such accents as those you've heard the Angel of Music, Christine."
"Yes," she said solemnly, "in my dressing room. That's where he comes to give me my lessons daily."
"In your dressing room?" he echoed stupidly.
"Yes, that's where I've heard him, and I've not been the only one to hear him."
"Who else heard him, Christine?"
"You, my friend."
"I heard the Angel of Music?"
"Yes, the other evening. It was he who was talking when you were listening behind the door. It was he who said you must love me. But then I thought I was the only one to hear his voice. Imagine my astonishment when you told me this morning that you could hear him too." At this Raoul burst out laughing. The first rays of the moon came and shrouded the two young people in their light, and Christine turned on Raoul with a hostile air. Her eyes, usually so gentle, flashed fire. "What are you laughing at? You think you heard a man's voice, I suppose?"
"Well,"
replied the young man, whose ideas began to grow confused in the face of Christine's determined attitude. "It's you, Raoul, who say that? You, an old playfellow of my own, a friend of my father's. But you've changed since those days. What are you thinking of? I'm an honest girl, Monsieur de le Viscount de Chaugnay, and I don't lock myself up in my dressing room with men's voices. If you'd opened the door, you'd have seen that there was nobody in the room."
"That's true. I did open the door when you were gone, and I found no one in the room."
"So you see? Well?" The Viscount summoned up all his courage. "Well, Christine, I think someone's making a game of you." She gave a cry at this and ran away. He ran after her, but in a tone of fierce anger she called out, "Leave me! Leave me!" And she disappeared. Raoul returned to the inn feeling very weary, very low-spirited, and very sad. He was told that Christine had gone to her bedroom, saying that she would not be down to dinner. Raoul dined alone in a very gloomy mood. Then he went to his room and tried to read, went to bed and tried to sleep. There was no sound in the next room. The hours passed slowly. It was about 11:30 when he distinctly heard someone moving with a light, stealthy step in the room next to his. Then Christine had not gone to bed. Without troubling for a reason, Raoul dressed, taking care not to make a sound, and waited. Waited for what? How could he tell? But his heart thumped in his chest when he heard Christine's door turn slowly on its hinges. Where was she going at this hour, when everyone was fast asleep at Kyros? Softly opening the door, he saw Christine's white form in the moonlight, slipping along the passage, and she went down the stairs, and he leaned over the banister over her. Suddenly he heard two voices in rapid conversation. He caught one sentence. "Don't lose the key." It was the landlady's voice. The door facing the sea was opened and locked again, and then all was still. Raoul ran back to his room and threw back the window. Christine's white form stood on the deserted quay. The first floor of the setting sun was at no great height, and a tree growing against the wall held out its branches to Raoul's impatient arms, and enabled him to climb down unknown to the landlady. Her amazement, therefore, was all the greater when the next morning the young man was brought back to her, half frozen, more dead than alive, and when she learned that he had been found stretched at full length on the steps of the high altar of the little church. She ran at once to tell Christine, who hurried down and with the help of the landlady did her best to revive him. He soon opened his eyes, and was not long in recovering when he saw his friend's charming face leaning over him. A few weeks later, when the tragedy of the opera compelled the intervention of the public prosecutor, Monsieur Mifroid, the commissary of police, examined the Viscount de Chagny touching the events of the night in Kyros. I quote the questions and answers, as given in the official report, pages 150 and continuing in the sequence. "Did Mademoiselle Day not see you come down from your room by the curious road which you selected?" "No, monsieur, no, although, when walking behind her, I took no pains to deaden the sound of my footsteps. In fact, I was anxious that she should turn round and see me. I realized that I had no excuse for following her, and that this way of spying on her was unworthy of me. But she seemed not to hear me, and I acted exactly as though I were not there. She quietly left the quay, and then suddenly walked quickly up the road. The church clock had struck 11:45, and I thought that this must have made her hurry, for she began to run and continued hastening until she came to the church." "Was the gate open?" "Yes, monsieur, and this surprised me, but it didn't seem to surprise Mademoiselle Day." "Was there no one in the churchyard?" "I didn't see anyone, and if there had been I must have seen him. The moon was shining, and the snow had made the night quite light." "Was it possible for anyone to hide behind the tombstones?" "No, monsieur, they were quite small, poor tombstones, partly hidden under the snow, with their crosses just above the level of the ground. The only shadows were those of the crosses and ourselves. The church stood out quite brightly. I never saw so clear a night. It was very fine and very cold, and one could see everything." "Are you at all superstitious?" "No, monsieur, I am a practicing Catholic." "In what condition of mind were you?" "Very healthy and peaceful, I assure you. Mademoiselle Day's curious action in going out at that hour had worried me at first, but as soon as I saw her go to the churchyard I thought that she meant to fulfill some pious duty on her father's grave, and I considered this so natural I recovered all my calmness. I was only surprised she hadn't heard me walking behind her, for my footsteps were quite audible on the hard snow. But she must have been taken up with her intentions, and I resolved not to disturb her. She knelt down by her father's grave, made the sign of the cross, and began to pray. At that moment it struck midnight, and at the last stroke I saw Mademoiselle Day lift her eyes to the sky and stretch her arms out as though in ecstasy. I was wondering what the reason could be when I myself raised my head, and everything within me seemed drawn toward the invisible, which was playing the most perfect music. Christine and I knew that music. We had heard it as children, but it had never been executed with such divine art, even by Monsieur Day. I remembered all that Christine had told me, the angel of music. The air was the resurrection of Lazarus, which old Monsieur Day used to play to us in his hours of melancholy and of faith. If Christine's angel had existed, he couldn't have played better that night on the late musician's violin. When the music stopped, I seemed to hear a noise from the skulls in the heap of bones. It was though as they were chuckling. I couldn't help shuddering. Did it not occur to you that the musician might be hiding behind that very heap of bones? It was the one thought that did occur to me, monsieur, so much so that I omitted to follow Mademoiselle Day when she stood up and walked slowly to the gate. She was so much absorbed just then that I'm not surprised she didn't see me. Then what happened that you were found in the morning lying half dead on the steps of the high altar? First a skull rolled to my feet, then another. It was as if I were the mark of that ghastly game of bowls, and I had an idea that the false step must have destroyed the balance of the structure behind which our musician was concealed. This surmise seemed to be confirmed when I saw a shadow suddenly glide along the sacristy wall. I ran up, and the shadow had already pushed open the door and entered the church, but I was quicker than the shadow, and caught hold of a corner of its cloak. At that moment we were just in front of the high altar, and the moonbeams fell straight upon us through the stained glass windows of the apse. As I didn't let go of the cloak, the shadow turned round, and I saw a terrible death's head, which darted a look at me from a pair of scorching eyes. I felt as if I were face to face with Satan, and in the presence of this unearthly apparition my heart gave way, my courage failed me, and I remembered nothing more until I recovered consciousness at the setting sun. Chapter 6. A Visit to Box 5. We left Monsieur Firmin Richard and Monsieur Armand Moncharmin at the moment when they were deciding to look into that little matter of Box 5. Leaving behind them the broad staircase which leads from the lobby outside the manager's offices to the stage and its dependencies, they crossed the stage, went out by the subscriber's door, and entered the house through their first little passage on the left. Then they made their way through the front rows of stalls and looked at Box 5 in the grand tier. They couldn't see it well, because it was half in darkness, and because great covers were flung over the red velvet of the ledges of all the boxes. They were almost alone in the huge, gloomy house, and a great silence surrounded them. It was the time when most of the stage hands go out for a drink. The staff had left the boards for the moment, leaving a scene half set. A few rays of light, a wan, sinister light that seemed to have been stolen from an expiring luminary, fell through some opening or other upon an old tower that raised its pasteboard battlements on the stage. Everything in this deceptive light adopted a fantastic shape. In the orchestra stalls, the drugget covering them looked like an angry sea, whose glaucous waves had been suddenly rendered stationary by a secret order from the storm phantom, who, as everybody knows, is called Adamastor. Messieurs Moncharmin and Richard were the shipwrecked mariners amid this motionless turmoil of a calico sea. They made for the left boxes, ploughing their way like sailors who leave their ship and try to struggle to the shore. The 8 great polished columns stood up in the dusk like so many great piles, supporting the threatening, crumbling, big-bellied cliffs, whose layers were represented by the circular, parallel, waving lines of the balconies of the grand first and second tiers of boxes. At the top, or right on top of the cliff, lost in Monsieur Levipu's copper ceiling, figures grinned and grimaced, laughed and jeered at Messieurs Richard's and Moncharmin's distress. And yet these figures were usually very serious. Their names were Isis, Amphitrite, Hebe, Pandora, Psyche, Thetis, Pomona, Daphne, Clydia, Galatea, and Arethusa. Yes, Arethusa herself and Pandora, whom we all know by her box, looked down upon the two new managers of the opera, who ended by clutching at some piece of wreckage, and from there stared silently at box 5 on the grand tier. I've said that they were distressed. At least I presume so. Monsieur Moncharmin, in any case, admits that he was impressed. To quote his own words in his memoirs, "This smooth side about the opera ghost, in which, since we first took over the duties of Messieurs Paradis and Devienne, we had been so nicely steeped." Monsieur Moncharmin's style is not always irreproachable. "Had no doubt ended by blinding my imaginative and also visual faculties. It may be found that the exceptional surroundings in which we were, in the midst of an incredible silence, impressed us to an unusual extent. It may be that we were sport of a kind of hallucination brought about by the semi-darkness of the theatre and the partial gloom that filled box 5, but at any rate, I saw, and Richard also saw, a shape in box 5. Richard said nothing, nor I either, but we spontaneously seized each other's hand. We stood like that for some minutes, without moving, with our eyes fixed on the same point, but the figure had disappeared. Then we went out, and in the lobby communicated our impressions to each other, and talked about the shape. The misfortune that was my shape was not in the least like Richard's. I had seen a thing like a death's head resting on the ledge of the box, whereas Richard saw the shape of an old woman who looked like Madame Giry. We soon discovered we really had been the victims of an illusion, whereupon, without further delay, and laughing like madmen, we ran to box 5 on the grand tier, went inside, and found no such shapes of any kind. Box 5 is just like all the other grand tier boxes. There is nothing to distinguish it from any of the others. Monsieur Moncharmin and Monsieur Richard, ostensibly highly amused and laughing at each other, moved the furniture of the box. Wait, no, that was... Sorry, let me restart this paragraph, because that's... The memoirs ended a sentence and a half ago. Box 5 is just like all the other grand tier boxes. There's nothing to distinguish it from any of the others. Monsieur Moncharmin and Monsieur Richard, ostensibly highly amused and laughing at each other, moved the furniture of the box, lifted the cloths and the chairs, and particularly examined the armchair in which the man's voice used to sit. They saw that it was a respectable armchair with no magic about it. Altogether, the box was the most ordinary box in the world, with its red hangings, its chairs, its carpet, and its ledge covered in red velvet. After feeling the carpet in the most serious manner possible, and discovering nothing more here or anywhere else, they went down to this corresponding box on the pit tier below. In box 5 on the pit tier, which was just inside the first exit from the stalls on the left, they found nothing worth mentioning either. "Those people are all making fools of us," Richard ended by exclaiming. "It will be Faust on Saturday. Let's us both see the performance from box 5 on the grand tier." Chapter 7, Faust and What Followed. On the Saturday morning, on reaching their office, the joint managers found a letter from the opera ghost, worded in these terms.
"My dear managers, so it is to be war between us. If you still care for peace, here is my ultimatum. It consists of the 4 following conditions. You must give me back my private box, and I wish it to be at my free disposal from henceforward. The part of Margarita shall be sung this evening by Christine Day. Never mind about Carlotta, she will be ill. I absolutely insist upon the good and loyal services of Madame Giry, my box-keeper, whom you will reinstate in her functions forthwith. Let me know by a letter handed to Madame Giry, who will see that it reaches me, that you accept, as your predecessors did, the conditions in my memorandum book relating to my monthly allowance. I will inform you later how you are to pay it to me. If you refuse, you will give Faust tonight in a house with a curse upon it. Take my advice and be warned in time, opera ghost."
"But look here, I'm getting sick of him, shouted Richard, banging his fist down on the office table. Just then, Mercier, the acting manager, entered. Lachenal would like to see one of you gentlemen. He says that his business is urgent, and he seems quite upset.
Who's Lachenal?
He's your stud groom.
What do you mean, my stud groom?
Yes, sir, there are several grooms of the opera, and Monsieur Lachenal is at the head of them.
And what does this groom do?
He has the chief management of the stable.
What stable?
Why, yours, sir, the stable of the opera.
There's a stable of the opera? Upon my word, I didn't know. Where's it?
In the cellars, on the rotunda side. It's a very important department. We have 12 horses.
12 horses? And what for, in heaven's name?
Why, we want trained horses for the processions in the Juve, the Profeta, and so on. Horses used to the boards. It's the groom's business to teach them. Monsieur Lachenal is very clever at it. He used to manage Francone's stables.
Very well, but what does he want?
I don't know. I never saw him such a state.
He can come in.
Monsieur Lachenal came in, carrying a riding whip with which he struck his right boot in an irritable manner.
Good morning, Monsieur Lachenal. To what do we owe the honor of your visit?
Said Richard, somewhat impressed.
Mr. Manager, I've come to ask you to get rid of the whole stable.
What? You want to get rid of our horses?
I'm not talking of the horses, but of the stablemen.
How many stablemen have you, Monsieur Lachenal?
6 stablemen. That's at least 2 too many.
There are places,
Monsieur interposed,
created and forced upon us by the Undersecretary for Fine Arts. These are filled by protégés of the government, and if I may venture to—
I don't care a hang for the government, roared Richard.
We don't need more than 4 stablemen for 12 horses.
11, said the head riding master, correcting him.
12,
repeated Richard. 11, repeated Lachenal.
Oh, the acting manager told me you had 12 horses.
I did have 12, but I only have 11 since Caesar was stolen. And Monsieur Lachenal gave himself a great smack on the boot with his whip.
Has Caesar been stolen?
Cried the acting manager. Caesar, the white horse, and the Profeta? There are not 2 Caesars, said the stud groom dryly. I was 10 years at Francone's, and I've seen plenty of horses in my time. There are not 2 Caesars, and he has been stolen. How? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's why I've come to ask you to sack the whole stable.
What do your stablemen say?
All sorts of nonsense. Some of them accuse the supers, others pretend it's the acting manager's doorkeeper.
My doorkeeper? I'll answer for him as I would for myself, protested Mercier. But after all, Monsieur Lachenal, you must have some idea.
Yes, I have, Monsieur Lachenal declared. I have an idea, and I'll tell you what it is. There's no doubt about it in my mind. He walked up to the 2 managers and whispered, It's the ghost that did the trick. Richard gave a jump.
What, you too?
How do you mean I too? Isn't it natural after what I saw?
What did you see?
I saw, clearly as I see you now, a black shadow riding a white horse that was as like Caesar as 2 peas.
And did you run after them?
I did, and I shouted, but they were too fast for me. They disappeared in the darkness of the underground gallery.
That will do, Monsieur Lachenal. You can go. We will lodge a complaint against the ghost.
And sack my stable?
Oh, of course. Good morning.
Monsieur Lachenal bowed and withdrew, and Richard was practically foaming at the mouth.
Settle that idiot's account at once, please.
He's a friend of the government representatives, Monsieur ventured to say.
And he takes his vermouth for tortinis with Lagreen, Scroll, and Pursuit the lion hunter,
added Moncharmin.
We shall have the whole press against us. He'll tell the story of the ghost, and everybody will be laughing at our expense. We may as well be dead as ridiculous.
All right, say no more about it. At that moment the door opened. It must have been deserted by its usual Cerberus, for Madame Giry entered without ceremony, holding a letter in her hand, and said hurriedly, I beg your pardon. Excuse me, gentlemen, but I had a letter this morning from the opera ghost. He told me to come to you, that you had something to— She didn't complete the sentence. She saw Firmin Richard's face, and it was a terrible sight. He seemed practically ready to burst. He said nothing, he couldn't speak, but suddenly he acted. First his left arm seized upon the quaint person of Madame Giry, and made her describe so unexpected a semicircle that she uttered a despairing cry. Next his right foot imprinted its sole on the black taffeta of a skirt, which had certainly never before undergone a similar outrage in a similar place. The thing happened so quickly that Madame Giry, when in the passage, was still quite bewildered, and seemed not to understand. But suddenly she understood, and the opera rang with her indignant yells, her violent protests and threats. About the same time, Carlotta, who had a small house of her own in the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honore, rang for her maid, who brought her letters to her bed. Among them was an anonymous missive written in red ink in a hesitating, clumsy hand.
If you appear tonight, you must be prepared for a great misfortune at the moment when you open your mouth to sing. A misfortune worse than death.
The letter took away Carlotta's appetite for breakfast, and she pushed back her chocolate, sat up in bed, and thought hard. It wasn't the first letter of the kind which she had received, but never had one couched in such threatening terms. She thought herself at the time the victim of 1,000 jealous attempts, and went about saying that she had a secret enemy who had sworn to ruin her. She pretended that a wicked plot was being hatched against her, a cabal which would come to a head one of these days, but she added that she was not the woman to be intimidated. The truth is that if there was a cabal, it was led by Carlotta herself against poor Christine, who had no suspicion of it. Carlotta had never forgiven Christine for the triumph which she had achieved when taking her place at a moment's notice. When Carlotta heard of the astounding reception bestowed upon her understudy, she was at once cured of an incipient attack of bronchitis and a bad fit of sulking against the management, and lost the slightest inclination to shirk her duties. From that time she worked with all her might to smother her rival, enlisting the services of influential friends to persuade the managers not to give Christine an opportunity for a fresh triumph. Certain newspapers, which had begun to extol the talent of Christine, now interested themselves only in the fame of Carlotta. Lastly, in the theatre itself, the celebrated but heartless and soulless diva made the most scandalous remarks about Christine, and tried to cause her endless minor unpleasantness. When Carlotta had finished thinking over the threat contained in the strange letter, she got up. "We shall see," adding a few oaths in her native Spanish with a very determined air. The first thing she saw when looking out of her window was a hearse. She was very superstitious, and the hearse and the letter convinced her that she was running the most serious dangers that evening. She collected all her supporters, told them that she was threatened at that evening's performance with a plot organized by Christine Day, and declared that they must play a trick upon that chip by filling the house with her, Carlotta's, admirers. She had no lack of them, of course. She relied upon them to hold themselves prepared for any eventuality, and to silence the adversaries if, as she feared, they created a disturbance. Oh, Stay Hydrated Bot has just mentioned that it's been about an hour, roughly, at least in the live recording. The recording's getting close to an hour, so we should have at least 4 ounces of water. So I would suggest, taking that in if you're listening along. Anyway, let's return to what we were on about. Monsieur Richard's private secretary called to ask after the diva's health, and returned with the assurance that she was perfectly well, and that, were she dying, she would sing the part of Margarita that evening. The secretary urged her in his chief's name, to commit no imprudence, to stay at home all day, and to be careful of draughts. And Carlotta couldn't help, after he had gone, comparing this unusual and unexpected advice with the threats contained in the letter. It was 5 o'clock when the post brought a second anonymous letter in the same hand as the first. It was short and said simply,
"You have a bad cold. If you are wise, you'll see that it is madness to try to sing tonight."
Carlotta sneered. shrugged her handsome shoulders, and sang 2 or 3 notes to reassure herself. Ah. Her friends were faithful to their promise. They were all at the opera that night, but looked round in vain for the fierce conspirators whom they were instructed to suppress. The only unusual thing was the presence of Monsieur Richard and Monsieur Moncharmin in box 5. Carlotta's friends thought that perhaps the managers had caught wind on their side of the proposed disturbance, and so that they had determined to be in the house as to stop it then and there, but this was unjustifiable supposition, as the reader knows. Monsieur Richard and Moncharmin were thinking of nothing but their ghost.
Vain, in vain do I call, though my vigil weary, on creation and its Lord. Never reply will break the silence dreary, no sign, no single word.
The famous baritone, Carolus Fonta, had hardly finished Dr. Faust's first appeal to the powers of darkness when Monsieur Firmin Richard, who was sitting in the ghost's own chair, the front chair on the right, leaned over to his partner and asked him chaffingly,
"Well, has the ghost whispered a word in your ear yet?"
"Wait, don't be in such a hurry," replied Monsieur Armand Moncharmin in the same pleased tone.
"The performance has only begun, and you know that the ghost does not usually come until the middle of the first act."
The first act did indeed pass without incident, which didn't surprise Carlotta's friends, because Margarita doesn't sing in this act. As for the managers, they looked at each other when the curtain fell.
"That's one." "Yes, the ghost is late." "It's not a bad house for a house with a curse on it."
Monsieur Richard smiled and pointed to a fat, rather vulgar woman, dressed in black, sitting in a stall in the middle of the auditorium, with a man in a broadcloth frock coat on either side of her.
"Who on earth are those?" "Those, my dear fellow, are my concierge, her husband, and her brother." "Did you give them their tickets?" "I did. My concierge has never been to the opera. This is his first time. And as now she's going to come every night, I wanted her to have a good seat before spending her time showing other people theirs." Moncharmin asked what he meant, and Richard answered that he'd persuaded his concierge, in whom he'd taken the greatest confidence, to come and take Madame Giry's place. Yes, he would like to see if, with that woman instead of the old lunatic, box 5 would continue to astonish the natives. "By the way," said Moncharmin, "you know that Mother Giry is going to lodge a complaint against you." "With whom? The ghost?"
The ghost. Moncharmin had almost forgotten him. However, that mysterious person did nothing to bring himself to the memory of the managers, and they were just saying so to each other for the second time, when the door of the box suddenly opened to admit the startled stage manager.
"What's the matter?"
they both asked, amazed at seeing him there at such a time. "It seems there's a plot gone up by Christine Day's friends against Carlotta. Carlotta's furious."
"What on earth?"
said Richard, knitting his brows. But the curtain rose on the kermesse scene, and Richard made a sign to the stage manager to go away. When the two were alone again, Moncharmin leaned over to Richard.
"Then Day has friends?" "Yes, he has."
"Whom?" Richard glanced across the box at the grand tier containing no one but 2 men.
"The Count de Sonnier?"
"Yes, he spoke to me in her favour with such warmth that if I had not known him to be Sorelli's friend—"
Really? And who's that pale young man behind him?"
"That's his brother, the Viscount."
"He ought to be in bed, he looks ill."
And the stage rang with excited song. "Red or white liquor, coarse or fine, what can it matter, so we have wine?" Students, citizens, soldiers, girls, and matrons whirled light-heartedly before the inn with the figure of Bacchus for a sign. Sibyl made her entrance. Christine Day looked charming in her boy's clothes, and Carlotta's partisans expected to hear her greeted with an ovation which would have enlightened them as to the intentions of her friends, but nothing happened. On the other hand, when Marguerite crossed the stage and sang the only 2 lines allotted her in this second act, "No, my lord, not a lady am I, nor yet a beauty, and do not need an arm to help me on my way," Carlotta was received with enthusiastic applause. It was so unexpected and so uncalled for that those who knew nothing about the rumors looked at one another and asked what was happening. And this act was also finished without incident. Then everybody said, of course, it'll be during the next act. Some, who seemed to be better informed than the rest, declared that the row would begin with the Ballad of the King of Thule, and rushed to the subscribers' entrance to warn Carlotta. The managers left the box during the entr'acte to find out more about the cabal of which the stage manager had spoken, but they soon returned to their seats, shrugging their shoulders and treating the whole affair as silly. The first thing they saw on entering the box was a box of English sweets on the little shelf of the ledge. Who had put it there? They asked the box keepers, but none of them knew. Then they went back to the shelf, and next to the box of sweets found an opera glass. They looked at each other, and they had no inclination to laugh. All that Madame Giry had told them had returned to their memory, and then, they seemed to feel a curious sort of draught around them, and they sat down in silence. The scene represented Margarita's garden. Gentle flowers in the dew, be message from me. As she sang these first two lines with her bunch of roses and lilacs in her hand, Christine, trusting her head, saw the Viscount de Chauny in his box, and from that moment her voice seemed less sure, less crystal clear than usual. Something seemed to deaden and dull her singing. "What a strange girl she is," said one of Carlotta's friends in the stalls, almost aloud. "The other day she was divine, and tonight she's simply bleeding. She has no experience, no training." "Gentle flowers, lie ye there, and tell her from me." The Viscount put his head under his hands and wept, and the Count behind him viciously gnawed his moustache, shrugged his shoulders, and frowned. For him, usually so cold and correct, to betray his inner feelings like that by outward signs, the Count must be very angry. And he was. He had seen his brother return from a rapid and mysterious journey in a simply alarming state of health. The explanation that had followed was unsatisfactory, and the Count had asked Christine Day for an appointment. She had the audacity to reply that she could not see him or his brother. "Would she deign but to hear me, and with one smile cheer me?" "The little baggage," growled the Count, and he wondered what she wanted, what she was hoping for. She was a virtuous girl. She was said to have no friend, no protector of any sort. That angel from the north must be very artful. Raoul, behind the curtain of his hands that veiled his boyish tears, thought only of the letter which he had received on his return to Paris, where Christine, fleeing from Paris like a thief in the night, had arrived before him. "My dear little playfellow, you must have the courage not to see me again, not to speak of me again. If you love me, even just a little, do this for me who will never forget you, my dear Raoul. My life depends on it, your life depends on it. Your little Christine." Thunders of applause rang as Carlotta made her entrance. I wish I could know, but who was he that addressed me, if he was noble, or at least what his name is? When Margarita had finished singing the ballad of the King of Thule, she was loudly cheered, and again when she came to the end of the jewel song. "Ah, the joy of past compare, these jewels bright to wear." Thenceforth, certain of herself, certain of her friends in the house, certain of her voice and her success, fearing nothing, Carlotta flung herself into her part without restraint or modesty. She was no longer Margarita, she was Carmen. She was applauded all the more, and her debut with Faust seemed about to bring her a new success, when suddenly a terrible thing happened. Faust had knelt on one knee.
"Let me gaze upon the form below me, while from yonder either blue, look how the star of eve, bright and tender, lings over me, to love thy beauty too."
Also, I 0% know this opera, Faust. I'm just improvising. And Margarita replied, "Oh, how strange, like a spell does the evening bind me, in a deep languid charm I feel without alarm, with its melody enwind me, and all my heart subdue." At that moment, at that identical moment, the terrible thing happened.
Carlotta croaked like a toad. There was consternation on Carlotta's face, and consternation on all the faces of the audience. The two managers in their box couldn't suppress an exclamation of horror. Everyone felt the thing was not natural. There was witchcraft behind it. That toad smelt of brimstone. Poor, wretched, despairing, crushed Carlotta. The uproar in the house was indescribable. If the thing had happened to anyone but Carlotta, she would have been hooted. But everybody knew how perfect an instrument her voice was, and there was no display of anger, but only of horror and dismay. The sort of dismay which men would have felt if they had witnessed the catastrophe that broke the arms of the Venus de Milo, and even then they would have seen and understood. But here that toad was incomprehensible, so much so that after some seconds spent in asking herself if she had really heard that note, that sound, that infernal noise issue from her throat, she tried to persuade herself that it was not so, that she was the victim of an illusion of the ear, and not of an act of treachery on the part of her voice. Meanwhile, in box 5, Moncharmin and Richard had turned very pale. This extraordinary and inexplicable incident filled them with a dread which was the more mysterious inasmuch as for some little while they had fallen within the direct influence of the ghost. They had felt his breath. Moncharmin's hair stood on end, and Richard wiped the perspiration from his forehead. Yes, the ghost was there, around them, behind them, beside them. They felt his presence without seeing him. They heard his breath, close, close, close to them. They were sure that there were 3 people in the box. They trembled. They thought of running away. They dared not. They dared not make a movement or exchange a word that would have told the ghost they knew he was there. What was going to happen? They wondered. And then this happened. Gah! The joint exclamation of horror was heard all over the house. They felt that they were smarting under the ghost's attacks. Leaning over the ledge of their box, they stared at Carlotta as though they didn't recognize her. That infernal girl must have given the signal for some catastrophe. They were waiting for the catastrophe. The ghost had told them it would come. The house had a curse upon it. The 2 managers gasped and panted under the weight of the catastrophe, and Richard's stifled voice was heard calling to Carlotta.
Well, go on.
No, Carlotta didn't go on. Bravely, heroically, she started afresh on the fatal line at the end of which the toad had appeared. An awful silence succeeded the uproar, and Carlotta's voice alone once more filled the resounding house. I feel without alarm. The audience also felt, but not without alarm. I feel without alarm, I feel without alarm. With its melody enwind me, and all my heart so... The toad had also started afresh, and the house broke into a wild tumult. The 2 managers collapsed in their chairs and dared not even turn round. They had not the strength. The ghost was chuckling behind their backs. Yet at last they distinctly heard his voice in their right ears, the impossible voice, the mouthless voice, saying, She is singing tonight to bring a chandelier down. With one accord they raised their eyes to the ceiling and uttered a terrible cry. The chandelier, the immense mass of the chandelier, was slipping down, coming toward them in the call of that fiendish voice. Released from its hook, it plunged from the ceiling and came smashing into the middle of the stalls, amid 1,000 shouts of terror. A wild rush for the doors followed. The papers of the day state that there were numbers wounded and 1 killed. The chandelier had crashed down upon the head of the wretched woman who had come to the opera for the first time in her life, the one whom Monsieur Richard had appointed to succeed Madame Curie, the ghost box-keeper, in her functions. She died on the spot, and the next morning a newspaper appeared with this heading: 200 kilos on the head of a concierge. That was her sole epitaph. Alright, folks, we kind of took a little water break earlier there, but we're between chapters, so I'm going to suggest that you, if you're watching the live stream, just bear with me, but if you're listening to the recording, pause the video, go grab a snack, maybe some water, stretch your legs. It's been about an hour. It's that time. Anyway, I hope everyone had a good
Good stretch, good snack break. Let's get right back into it with chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, The Mysterious Program. The tragic evening was bad for everybody. Carlotta fell ill, and as for Christine Day, she disappeared after the performance. A fortnight elapsed during which she was seen neither at the opera nor outside. Raoul, of course, was the first to be astonished at the prima donna's absence. He wrote to her at Madame Valerius's flat, and received no reply. His grief increased, and he ended up by being seriously alarmed at never seeing her name on the program. Faust was played without her. One afternoon he went to the manager's office to ask the reason of Christine's disappearance, and he found them both look extremely worried. Their own friend didn't recognize them. They had lost all their gaiety and spirits. They were seen crossing the stage with hanging heads, careworn brows, pale cheeks, as though pursued by some abominable thought or a prey to some persistent sport of fate. The fall of the chandelier had involved them in no little responsibility, but it was difficult to make them speak about it. The inquest had ended in a verdict of accidental death, caused by the wear and tear of the chains by which the chandelier was hung from the ceiling. But it was the duty of both the old and the new managers to have discovered this wear and tear and to have it remedied in time. And I feel bound to say that Messieurs Montcharmin and Richard at this time appeared so changed, so absent-minded, so mysterious, so incomprehensible, that many of the subscribers thought that some event even more horrible than the fall of the chandelier must have affected their state of mind. In their daily intercourse they showed themselves very impatient, except with Madame Giry, who had been reinstated in her functions. And in their reception of the Viscount de Chauny, when he came to ask about Christine, was anything but cordial. They merely told him that she was taking a holiday. He asked how long the holiday was for, and they replied curtly that it was for an unlimited period, as Mademoiselle Day had requested leave of absence for reasons of health. Then she's ill. What is the matter with her?
We don't know.
Didn't you send the doctor to the opera to see her?
No, she didn't ask for him. And as we trust her, we took her word.
Raoul left the building a prey to the gloomiest thoughts, and he resolved, come what night, to go and inquire of Mamma Valerius. He remembered the strong phrases in Christine's letter forbidding him to make any attempt to see her, but what he had seen at Perros, what he had heard behind the dressing-room door, his conversation with Christine at the edge of the moor, made him suspect some machination which, devilish though it may be, was none the less human. The girl is highly strung. Can I speak English, please? The girl's highly strung imagination, her affectionate and credulous mind, the primitive education which had surrounded her childhood with a circle of legends, the constant brooding over a dead father, and, above all, the state of sublime ecstasy into which music threw her from the moment that this art was made manifest to her in certain exceptional conditions, as in the churchyard at Perros, all this seemed to him to constitute a moral ground only too favourable for the malevolent designs of some mysterious and unscrupulous person. Of whom was Christine Day the victim? This was the very reasonable question which Raoul put to himself as he hurried off to Mamma Valerius. He trembled as he rang at the little flat in the Rue Notre-Dame des Victoires. The door was opened by the maid who he had seen coming out of Christine's dressing-room one evening, and he asked if he could speak to Madame Valerius. He was told that she was ill in bed and was not receiving visitors. "Then take my card, please." "Then take my card, please," he said. The maid soon returned and showed him into a small and scantily furnished drawing-room, in which portraits of Professor Valerius and old Day hung on opposite walls. "Madame begs Monsieur the Viscount to excuse her. She can only see him in her bedroom, because she can no longer stand on her poor legs." 5 minutes later, Raoul was ushered into an ill-lit room where at once he recognized the good, kind face of Christine's benefactress in the semi-darkness of an alcove. Mamma Valerius's hair had now grown white, but her eyes had grown no older, Never, on the contrary, had their expression been so bright, so pure, so childlike. Monsieur de Chauny, she cried gaily, putting out both her hands to her visitor. Oh, it's heaven that sends you here. We can talk of her. The last sentence sounded very gloomily in the young man's ears, and he at once asked, Madame, where is Christine? And the old lady replied calmly, She's with her good genius. What good genius? Why, the angel of music. The Viscount at this dropped into a chair. Really? Christine was with the angel of music? And there lay Mamma Valerius in bed, smiling to him and putting her finger to her lips to warn him to be silent? And she added, You mustn't tell anyone. You can rely on me. He hardly knew what he was saying, for his ideas about Christine, already greatly confused, were becoming more and more entangled, and it seemed as if everything was beginning to turn around him, around the room, around that extraordinary good lady with the white hair and the forget-me-not eyes. I know, I can. But why don't you come near me as you used to do when you were a little one? Give me your hands as when you brought me the story of the little lot that Daddy Day had told you. I'm very fond of you, Monsieur Raoul, you know, and so is Christine, too. She's fond of me, sighed the young man. He found a difficulty in collecting his thoughts and bringing them to bear on Mamma Valerius's good genius, on the angel of music, whom Christine had spoken to him so strangely on the death's head which he had seen in a sort of nightmare, on the high altar at Pyros, and also on the opera ghost, whose fame had come to his ears one evening, when he was standing behind the scenes within hearing of a group of scene-shifters who were repeating the ghastly description which the hanged man, Joseph Bouquet, had given of the ghost before his mysterious death. He asked in a low voice, What makes you think that Christine is fond of me, madame? She used to speak of you every day. Really? And what did she tell you? She told me that you'd made her a proposal. And the good old lady began laughing wholeheartedly. Raoul sprang from his chair, flushing to his temples, suffering agonies. What's this? Where are you going? Sit down again at once, will you? Do you think I'll let you go like that? If you're angry with me for laughing, I beg your pardon. After all, what has happened isn't your fault. Didn't you know? Did you think that Christine was free? Is Christine engaged to be married? The wretched Raoul asked in a choking voice. Why, no, you know as well as I do Christine couldn't marry even if she wanted to. But I don't know anything about it, and why can't Christine marry? Because they're the angel of music, of course. I don't follow. Yes, he forbids her to. He forbids her? The angel of music forbids her to marry? No, he forbids her without forbidding her. It's like this. He tells her that if she got married, she'd never hear him again, that's all. And he would go away forever. So you understand, she can't let the angel of music go. It's quite natural. Yes, it's quite natural. Besides, I thought Christine had told you all that when she met you at Pyros, when she went with her good genius. Oh, she went to Pyros with her good genius, did she? That is to say, he arranged to meet her down there, in the Pyros graveyard at Day's grave. He promised to play her the resurrection of Lazarus on her father's violin. Raoul de Chauny rose and with a very authoritative air pronounced these peremptory words. Madame, you will have the goodness to tell me where that genius lives. The old lady didn't seem surprised at this indiscreet command, and she raised her eyes and said, In heaven. Such simplicity baffled him. He didn't know what to say in the presence of this candid and perfect faith in a genius who came down nightly from heaven to haunt the dressing-rooms of the opera. He now realized the possible state of mind of a girl brought up between a superstitious fiddler and a visionary old lady, and he shuddered when he thought of the consequences of it all. Is Christine still a good girl? He asked suddenly, in spite of himself. I swear it as I hope to be saved, exclaimed the old woman, who at this time seemed to be incensed. And if you doubt it, sir, I don't know what you're in here for. At this Raoul tore at his gloves.
How long has she known this genius?
About 3 months, yes, it's been quite 3 months since he began to give her lessons. The Viscount threw up his arms with a gesture of despair.
The genius gives her lessons, and where, pray?
Now that she's gone away with him, I can't say. But up to a fortnight ago, it was in Christine's dressing room. It would be impossible in this little flat. The whole house would hear them. Whereas at the opera at 8 o'clock in the morning, there's no one about, do you see?
Yes, I see.
And he hurriedly took leave of Madame Valerius, who asked if the young nobleman was not a little off his head. He walked home to his brother's house in a pitiful state. He could have struck himself, banged his head against the walls, to think that he had believed in her innocence, in her purity. The angel of music. He knew him now, he saw him. It was beyond a doubt some unspeakable tenor, a good-looking jackanapes, who mouthed and simpered as he sang. He thought himself as absurd and as wretched as could be. Oh, what a miserable, little, insignificant, silly young man was Monsieur de la Viscount de Chauny, thought Raoul furiously. And she, what a bold and damnable, sly creature. His brother was waiting for him, and Raoul fell into his arms like a child. The Count consoled him, of course, without asking for explanations, and Raoul would certainly have long hesitated before telling him the story of the Angel of Music. His brother suggested taking him out to dinner, and overcome as he was with despair, Raoul would have probably refused any invitation that evening if the Count had not, as an inducement, told him that the lady of his thoughts had been seen the night before in the company of the other sex and the boys. At first the Viscount refused to believe, but he received such exact details that he ceased protesting. She had been seen, it appeared, driving in a brougham, with a window down. She seemed to be slowly taking in the icy night air. There was a glorious moon shining. She was recognized beyond a doubt. As for her companion, only a shadowy outline was distinguished leaning back in the dark. The carriage was going at a walking pace in the lonely drive behind the grandstand at Longchamp. Raoul dressed in frantic haste, prepared to forget his distress by flinging himself, as the people say, into the vortex of pleasure. Alas, he was a very sorry guest, and, leaving his brother early, found himself, by 10 o'clock in the evening, in a cab behind the Longchamp racecourse. It was bitterly cold. The road seemed deserted and very bright under the moonlight. He told the driver to wait for him patiently at the corner of a near turning, and, hiding himself as well as he could, stood stamping his feet to keep warm. He had been indulging in this healthy exercise for half an hour or so, when a carriage turned the corner of the road and came quietly in his direction at a walking pace. As it approached, he saw that a woman was leaning her head from the window, and suddenly the moon shed a pale gleam over her features. "Christine!" The sacred name of his love had sprung from his heart and his lips. He couldn't keep it back. He would have given anything to withdraw it, for that name, proclaimed in the stillness of the night, had acted as though it were the preconcerted signal for a furious rush on the part of the whole turnout, which dashed past him before he could put in execution his plan of leaping at the horses' heads. The carriage window had been closed, and the girl's face had disappeared, and the brougham, behind which he was now running, was no more than a black spot on the white road. He called out again, "Christine!" No reply, and he stopped in the midst of the silence. With a lackluster eye he stared down that cold, desolate road and into the pale, dead night. Nothing was colder than his heart, nothing half so dead. He'd loved an angel, and now he despised a woman. Raoul, how that little fairy of the north has trifled with you. Was it really, really necessary to have so fresh and young a face, a forehead so shy and always ready to cover itself with a pink blush of modesty, in order to pass in the lonely night in a carriage and pair accompanied by some mysterious lover? Surely there should be some limit to hypocrisy and lying. She had passed without answering his cry, and he was thinking of dying, and he was 20 years old. His valet found him in the morning, sitting on his bed. He had not undressed, and the servant feared at the sight of his face that some disaster had occurred. Raoul snatched his letters from the man's hands, and he recognized Christine's paper and handwriting. "Dear, go to the masked ball at the opera on the night after tomorrow. At 12 o'clock, be in the little room behind the chimney place of the big crush room. Stand near the door that leads to the rotunda. Don't mention this appointment to anyone on earth. Wear a white domino and be carefully masked. As you love me, do not let yourself be recognized. Christine."
Ooh, this is one of my favorite scenes, and it's one of my favorite pieces from the musical, too. Like, I don't know if y'all have listened to the stage play. By Sir Andrew, but it's a real thing. It's good. And I'll admit that the closest I've gotten to the actual play, because of the difficulty of accessing, good musical theater, especially in the place where I'm at, the closest I've gotten is the 2004 film. But it's just in my brain, just that, masquerade, every face a different shade. Masquerade, hide your face so the world will never find you. Masquerade, every face a different shade. Masquerade, hide your face. There's another mask behind you. Anyway, I digress. Chapter 9, At the Masked Ball. The envelope was covered with mud and it was unstamped. It bore the words, "To be handed to Monsieur de la Viscount de Raoul de Chauny," with the address in pencil. It must have been flung out in the hope that a passer-by would pick up the note and deliver it, which was what happened. The note had been picked up on the pavement of the Place de l'Opéra. Raoul read it over again with his fevered eyes. No more was needed to revive his hope. The somber picture which he had for a moment imagined of a Christine forgetting her duty to herself made way for his original conception of an unfortunate innocent child, the victim of imprudence and exaggerated sensibility. To what extent at this time was she really a victim? Whose prisoner was she? Into what whirlpool had she been dragged? He asked himself these questions with a cruel anguish, but even this pain seemed endurable beside the frenzy into which he was thrown at the thought of a lying and deceitful Christine. What had happened? What influence had she undergone? What monster had carried her off, and by what means? By what means indeed but that of music? He knew Christine's story. After her father's death she acquired a distaste of everything in life, including her art. She went through the conservatory like a poor soulless singing machine. And then suddenly she awoke, as though through the intervention of a god. The angel of music appeared upon the scene, and she sang Margarita and Faust and triumphed. The angel of music. For 3 months the angel of music had been giving Christine lessons. Oh, he was a punctual singing master, and now he was taking her for drives in the Bois. Raoul's fingers clutched at his flesh, above his jealous heart. In his inexperience, he now asked himself with terror what game the girl was playing. Up to what point could an opera singer make a fool of a good-natured young man, quite new to love? Oh, misery! Thus did Raoul's thoughts fly from one extreme to the other. He no longer knew whether to pity Christine or to curse her, and he pitied her and cursed her turn and turn about. At all events, he bought a white domino. The hour of the appointment came at last. With his face in a mask, trimmed with long, thick lace, looking like a parrot in his white wrap, the Viscount thought himself very ridiculous. Men of the world don't go to the opera ball in fancy dress. It was absurd. One thought, however, consoled the Viscount. He would certainly never be recognized. The ball was an exceptional affair, given some time before Shrovetide, in honor of the anniversary of the birth of a famous draftsman, and it was expected to be much gayer, noisier, bohemian than the ordinary masked ball. Numbers of artists had arranged to go, accompanied by a whole cohort of models and pupils who, by midnight, began to create a tremendous din, as artists tend to do. Raoul climbed the grand staircase at 5 minutes to 12, didn't linger to look at the motley dresses displayed all the way up the marble steps, one of the richest settings in the world, allowed no facetious mask to draw him into a war of wits, replied to no jests, and shook off the bold familiarity of a number of couples who had already become a trifle too gay.
Crossing the big crush room and escaping from a mad whirl of dancers in which he was caught for a moment, he at last entered the room mentioned in Christine's letter. He found it crammed, for this small space was the point where all those who were going to supper in the rotunda crossed those who were returning from taking a glass of champagne. The fun here waxed fast and furious. Raoul leaned against a door-post and waited. He didn't wait long. A black domino passed and gave a quick squeeze to the tips of his fingers. He understood that it was she and followed her. "Is that you, Christine?" he asked between his teeth. Hang on, I want to try and do his voice. "Is that you, Christine?" he asked between his teeth. The black domino turned round promptly and raised her finger to her lips, no doubt to warn him to not mention her name again. Raoul continued to follow her in silence. He was afraid of losing her after meeting her again in such strange circumstances. His grudge against her was gone. He no longer doubted that she had nothing to reproach herself with, however peculiar and inexplicable her conduct might seem. He was ready to make any display of clemency, forgiveness, or cowardice. He was in love, and no doubt he would soon receive a very natural explanation of her curious absence. The black domino turned back from time to time to see if the white domino was still following. And as Raoul once more passed through the great crush room, this time in the wake of his guide, he couldn't help noticing a group crowding round a person whose disguise, eccentric air, and gruesome appearance were causing a sensation. It was a man dressed all in scarlet, with a huge hat and feathers on top of a wonderful death's head. From his shoulders hung an immense red velvet cloak, which trailed along the floor like a king's train, and on this cloak was embroidered in gold letters, which everyone read and repeated aloud, "Don't touch me. I am the Red Death stalking abroad." And then one greatly daring did try to touch him, but a skeletal hand shot out of a crimson sleeve and violently seized the rash of one's wrists. And he, feeling the clutch of the knuckle-bones, the furious grasp of death, uttered a cry of pain and terror. And when the Red Death released him at last, he ran away like a very madman, pursued by the jeers of the bystanders. It was at this moment that Raoul passed in front of the funereal masquerader, who had just happened to turn in his direction, and he nearly exclaimed, "The death's head of Kyros." He'd recognized him. He wanted to dart forward, forgetting Christine, but the black domino, who also seemed a prey to some strange excitement, caught him by the arm and dragged him from the crush room, far from the mad crowd through which the Red Death was stalking. The black domino kept on turning back, and, apparently on 2 occasions, saw something that startled her, for she hurried her pace and Raoul's, as though they were being pursued. They went up 2 floors, and here the stairs and corridors were almost deserted. The black domino opened the door of a private box and beckoned to the white domino to follow her. Then Christine, whom he recognized by the sound of her voice, closed the door behind them and warned him in a whisper to remain at the back of the box and on no account to show himself. Raoul took off his mask and Christine kept hers on. And when Raoul was about to ask her to remove it, he was surprised to see her put her ear to the partition and listen eagerly for a sound outside. Then she opened the door ajar, looked out into the corridor, and in a low voice said, "He must have gone up higher." Suddenly she exclaimed, "He's coming down again." She tried to close the door, but Raoul prevented her, for he had seen on the top step of the staircase that led to the floor above a red foot, followed by another, and slowly, majestically, the whole scarlet dress of the Red Death met his eyes, and once more he saw the death's head of Kyros.
"It's him. This time he shall not escape me."
But Christine had slammed the door at the moment when Raoul was on the point of rushing out. He tried to push her aside. "Whom do you mean by he who shall not escape you?" Raoul tried to overcome the girl's resistance by force, but she repelled him with a strength which he would not have expected in her. He understood, or thought he understood, and at once lost his temper.
"Who? Why, he, the man who hides behind that hideous mask of death, the evil genius of the churchyard of Kyros, Red Death, in a word, madame, your friend, your angel of music. But I shall snatch off his mask as I shall snatch off my own, and this time we shall look each other in the eyes, and he and I, with no veil and no lies between us, and I shall know whom you love and who loves you."
He burst into a mad laugh, while Christine gave a disconsolate groan behind her velvet mask. With a tragic gesture, she flung out her 2 arms, which fixed a barrier of white flesh across the door. "In the name of our love, Raoul, you shall not pass." He stopped at this. What had she said? In the name of their love? Never before had she confessed that she loved him. And yet she had had opportunities enough. Her only object was to gain. Clearly her only object was to gain a few seconds. She wished to give the Red Death time to escape. In accents of childish hatred he said,
"You lie, madame, for you do not love me, and you've never loved me. What a poor fellow I must be to let you mock and flout me as you've done. Why did you give me every reason for hope at Paris? For honest hope, madame. I am an honest man. I believed you to be an honest woman when your only intention was to deceive me. Alas, you've deceived us all. You've taken such a shameful advantage of the candid affection of your benefactress herself, who continues to believe in your sincerity while you go about the opera hall with Red Death. I despise you."
And at this he burst into tears. She allowed him to insult her, and she thought of but one thing to keep him from leaving the box. "You will beg my pardon one day for all those ugly words, Raoul, and when you do I shall forgive you." He shook his head at this.
"No, no. You've driven me mad, when I think that I had only one object in life, to give my name to an opera wench."
"Raoul, how can you?"
"I shall die of shame."
"No, dear, live," said Christine's grave and changed voice. "And goodbye. Goodbye, Raoul." The boy stepped forward, staggering as he went, and he risked one more sarcasm.
"Oh, you must let me come and applaud you from time to time."
"I shall never sing again, Raoul."
"Really? So he's taking you off the stage? I congratulate you. But we shall meet at the boys' one of those evenings."
Not in the boys nor anywhere, Raoul. You shall not see me again."
May one ask at least to what darkness you're returning? For what hell are you leaving, mysterious lady, or for what paradise?"
"I came to tell you, dear, but I can't tell you now. You wouldn't believe me. You've lost faith in me, Raoul. It's finished." She spoke in such a despairing voice that the lad began to feel remorse for his cruelty.
"But look here. Can't you tell me what all this means? You're free. There's no one to interfere with you. You go about Paris. You put on a domino to come to the ball. Why do you not go home? What have you been doing this past fortnight? What is this tale about the angel of music which you've been telling Mamma Valerius? Someone may have taken you in, played upon your innocence. I was a witness of it myself at Paris, but you know what to believe now. You seem to be quite sensible, Christine. You know what you're doing, and meanwhile Mamma Valerius lies waiting for you at home and appealing to your good genius. Explain yourself, Christine, I beg of you. Anyone might have been deceived as I was. What is this farce?"
Christine simply took off her mask and said, "Dear, it is a tragedy." Raoul now saw her face and couldn't restrain an exclamation of surprise and horror. The fresh complexion of former days was gone, and a mortal pallor covered these features which he had known so charming and so gentle. Sorrow had furrowed them with pitiless lines, and traced dark and unspeakably sad shadows under her eyes.
My dearest, he groaned, holding out his arms. "You promised to forgive me."
Perhaps some day," she said, resuming her mask, and she went away, forbidding him with a gesture to follow her. He tried to disobey her, but she turned round and repeated her gesture of farewell with such authority that he dared not move a step. He watched her until she was out of sight, and then he also went down among the crowd, hardly knowing what he was doing, with throbbing temples and an aching heart, and as he crossed the dancing floor he asked if anybody had seen the Red Death. Yes, everybody had seen the Red Death, but Raoul could not find him, and at 2 o'clock in the morning he turned down the passage behind the scenes that led to Christine Day's dressing room. His footsteps took him to that room where he had first known suffering, and he tapped at the door. There was no answer. He entered as he had entered when he had looked everywhere for the man's voice. The room was empty. A gas jet was burning, and it was turned down low. He saw some writing paper on a little desk. He thought of writing to Christine, but he heard steps in the passage. He had only time to hide in the inner room, which was separated from the dressing room by a curtain. Christine entered, took off her mask with a weary movement, and flung it on the table. She sighed and let her pretty head fall into her two hands. What was she thinking of? Of Raoul? No, for Raoul heard her murmur, "Poor Eric." At first he thought he must be mistaken. To begin with, he was persuaded that if anyone was to be pitied, it was he, Raoul. It would have been quite natural if she'd said poor Raoul after what had happened between them, but shaking her head, she repeated, "Poor Eric." What did this Eric have to do with Christine's sighs, and why was she pitying Eric when Raoul was so unhappy? Christine began to write deliberately, calmly, and so placidly that Raoul, who was still trembling from the effects of the tragedy that separated them, was painfully impressed. "What coolness," he said to himself. She wrote on, filling 2, 3, 4 sheets. Suddenly she raised her head and hid the sheets in her bodice. She seemed to be listening Raoul, and Raoul joined her in that activity. Whence came that strange sound, that distant rhythm? A faint singing seemed to issue from within the walls. Yes, it was as though the walls themselves were singing. The song became plainer. The words were now distinguishable. He heard a voice, a very beautiful, very soft, very captivating voice. But for all its softness, it remained a male voice. The voice came nearer and nearer, and it came through the wall. It approached, and now the voice was in the room in front of Christine. Christine rose and addressed the voice as though speaking to someone. "Here I am, Eric. I'm ready, but you are late." Raoul, peeping from behind the curtain, couldn't believe his eyes, which showed him nothing. Christine's face lit up. A smile of happiness appeared upon her bloodless lips, a smile like that of sick people when they receive the first hope of recovery. The voice without a body went on singing, and certainly Raoul had never in his life heard anything more absolutely and heroically sweet, more gloriously insidious, more delicate, more powerful, in short, more irresistibly triumphant. He listened to it in a fever, and he now began to understand how Christine Daae was able to appear one evening before the stupefied audience with accents of a beauty hitherto unknown, of a superhuman exaltation, while doubtless still under the influence of the mysterious and invisible master. The voice was singing the wedding night song from Romeo and Juliet. Raoul saw Christine stretch out her arms to the voice as she had done in Perros churchyard to the invisible violin playing the resurrection of Lazarus, and nothing could describe the passion with which the voice sang.
"Fate links thee to me forever and a day."
That's absolute. That. I'm sorry, my improvisations make no sense for the time period because, when is this? 1800s France? Hang on. This is gonna bother me. One moment. Oh, dang it. Those are all Italian arias. That doesn't make any sense. Sorry, I don't have the inherent improvisational knowledge of French aria to improvise something that would make sense there. I don't know. I was kind of going for recitativo. Man, that's a difficult word there. I don't know, man. Because it said it was Romeo and Juliet. That's not really traditionally a musical, is it? I mean, anyway, I digress a great deal. The strains went through Raoul's heart, and struggling against the charm that seemed to deprive him of all his will and all his energy, and almost of all his lucidity at the moment when he needed them most, he succeeded in drawing back the curtain that hid him, and he walked to where Christine stood. She herself was moving to the back of the room, the whole wall of which was occupied by a great mirror that reflected her image, but not his, for he was just behind her, and entirely covered by her. "Fate links thee to me forever and a day." Christine walked toward her image in the glass, and the image came toward her. The two Christines, the real one and the reflection, ended by touching, and Raoul put out his arms to clasp the two in one embrace. But by a sort of dazzling miracle that sent him staggering, Raoul was suddenly flung back, while an icy blast swept over his face. He saw, not 2, not 4, not 8, but 20 Christines spinning round him, laughing at him and fleeing so swiftly he couldn't touch one of them. At last everything stood still again, and he saw himself in the glass, but Christine had disappeared. He rushed up to the glass and struck at the walls. Nobody. And meanwhile the room still echoed with a distant, passionate singing. Which way? Which way had Christine gone? Which way should she return? Would she return? Alas, she had not declared to him that everything was finished. And was the voice not repeating? Fate links thee to me forever and a day. To me? To whom? Then, worn out, beaten, empty-brained, he sat down on the chair which Christine had just left. Like her, he let his head fall into his hands, and when he raised it, the tears were streaming down his young cheeks, real heavy tears, like those which jealous children shed, tears that wept for a sorrow which was in no way fanciful, but which is common to all the lovers on the earth, and which he expressed aloud.
Who is this Eric?
That's a cool scene. I'm a fan of that scene. Chapter 10. Forget the name of the man's voice. The day after Christine had vanished before his eyes in a sort of dazzlement that still made him doubt the evidence of his senses, Monsieur de la Viscount de Chenier called to inquire at Mamma Valerius's. He came upon a charming picture, and Christine herself was seated by the bedside of the old lady, who was sitting up against the pillows knitting. The pink and white had returned to the young girl's cheeks. The dark rings around her eyes had disappeared, and Raoul no longer recognized the tragic faces of the day before. If the veil of melancholy over these adorable features had not still appeared to the young man as the last trace of the weird drama in whose toils that mysterious child was struggling, he could have believed that Christine was not its heroine at all. She rose without showing any emotion and offered him her hand, but Raoul's stupefaction was so great that he stood there, dumbfounded, without a gesture and without a word. "Well, Monsieur de Chenier," exclaimed Mamma Valerius, "don't you know our Christine? Her good genius has sent her back to us." "Mamma," the girl broke in promptly, while the deep blush mantled to her eyes, "I thought, Mamma, there was to be no more mention of that. You know there's no such thing as the angel of music." "But, child, he gave you lessons for 3 months." "Mamma, I have promised to explain everything to you one of these days, and I hope to do so, but you've promised me until that day to be silent and to ask me no more questions whatever." "Provided you've promised never to leave me again. But have you promised that, Miss Christine?" "Mamma, all this cannot interest Monsieur de Chenier." "On the contrary, mademoiselle," said the young man in a voice which he tried to make firm and brave, but still trembled. "Anything which concerns you interests me to an extent which perhaps you will one day understand. I do not deny that my surprise equals my pleasure at finding you with your adopted mother, and that after what happened between us yesterday, after what you said and what I was able to guess, I hardly expected to see you here so soon. I should be the first to delight at your return if you were not so bent on preserving a secrecy that may be fatal to you. I have been your friend too long to not be alarmed with Madame Valerius at a disastrous adventure which will remain dangerous so long as we've not unravelled its threads, and of which you certainly end by being the victim, Christine." At these words, Mamma Valerius tossed about in her bed. "What does this mean? Is Christine in danger?" she cried. "Yes, madame," said Raoul courageously, notwithstanding the signs which Christine made to him. My dear heavens!" exclaimed the good, simple old woman, gasping for breath. "You simply must tell me everything, Christine. Why did you try to reassure me, and what danger is it, Monsieur de Chenier?" "An impostor is abusing her good faith." "Is the angel of music an impostor?" "She told you herself there's no angel of music." "Then what is it, in heaven's name? You'll be the death of me." "There's a terrible mystery around us, madame. Around you, around Christine, a mystery much more to be feared than any number of ghosts or genii." Mamma Valerius turned a terrified face to Christine, who had already run to her adopted mother and was holding her in her arms. "Don't believe him, Mommy, don't believe him." "Then tell me you'll never leave me again," implored the widow. Christine was silent, and Raoul resumed. "That is what you must promise, Christine. It's the only thing that can reassure your mother and me. We will undertake not to ask you a single question about the past, if you promise us not to remain under our protection in the future." "That's an undertaking which I have not asked of you, and a promise which I refuse to make you," said the young girl haughtily. I am mistress of my own actions, Monsieur de Charnier. You have no right to control them, and I beg you to desist henceforth. As to what I have done during the last fortnight, there is only one man in the world who has the right to demand an account of me, my husband. Well, I have no husband, and I never mean to marry." She threw out her hands to emphasize her words, and Raoul turned pale, not only because of the words which he had heard, but because he had caught sight of a plain gold ring on Christine's finger.
"You have no husband, and yet you wear a wedding ring?"
He tried to seize her hand, but swiftly she drew it back. "That's a present," she said, blushing once more and vainly striving to hide her embarrassment.
"Christine, as you have no husband, that ring can only have been given by one who hopes to make you his wife. Why deceive us further? Why torture me still more? That ring is a promise, and that promise has been accepted."
"That's what I said," exclaimed the old lady.
"And what did she answer, madame?"
"What I chose," said Christine, driven to exasperation. "Don't you think, monsieur, that this cross-examination has lasted long enough? As far as I am concerned—" Raoul was afraid to let her finish her speech, and so he interrupted her.
"I beg your pardon for speaking as I did, mademoiselle. You know the good intentions that make me meddle just now in matters which you no doubt think have nothing to do with me. But allow me to tell you what I've seen. Now I've seen more than you suspect, Christine, or what I thought I saw, for to tell you the truth, I've sometimes been inclined to doubt the evidence of my eyes." "Well, what did you see, sir? I think you saw—" "I saw your ecstasy at the sound of the voice, Christine, the voice that came from the wall, or the next room to yours. Yes, your ecstasy.
And that is what makes me alarmed on your behalf. You're under a very dangerous spell, and yet it seems that you are aware of the imposture, because day to day you say that there is no angel of music. In that case, Christine, why did you follow him that time? Why did you stand up with radiant features as though you were really hearing angels? Ah, it's a very dangerous voice, Christine. For I myself, when I heard it, was so much fascinated by it that you vanished before my eyes without my seeing which way you passed. Christine, Christine, in the name of heaven, in the name of your Father who is in heaven now, and who loved you so dearly and loved me too, Christine, tell us, your benefactress and me, to whom does that voice belong? If you do, we will save you in spite of yourself. The name of the man who had the audacity to put a ring on your finger." "Monsieur de Charnier, you shall never know," the girl declared coldly. Thereupon, seeing the hostility with which her ward had addressed the Viscount, Mamma Valerius suddenly took Christine's part. "And if she does love that man, Monsieur de Viscount, then even then it is no business of yours." "Alas, madame," Raoul humbly replied, unable to restrain his tears. "Alas, I believe that Christine really does love him. But it is not only that which drives me to despair, for what I am not certain of, madame, is that the man whom Christine loves is worthy of her love." "It's for me to be the judge of that, monsieur," said Christine, looking Raoul angrily in the face. "When a man," continued Raoul, "adopts such romantic methods to entice a young girl's affections, that man must either be a villain or the girl a fool." "That man must either be a villain or the girl a fool, is that it? Christine." Raoul, why do you condemn a man whom you've never seen, whom no one knows, and about whom you yourself know nothing?" "Yes, Christine, yes. I at least know the name that you thought to keep from me forever. The name of your angel of music, mademoiselle, is Eric." Christine at once betrayed herself, and she turned white as a sheet, and stammered, Who told you?" "You yourself." "How do you mean?"
"By pitying him the other night, the night of the masked ball."
"When you went to your dressing room, did you not say, 'Poor Eric'? Well, Christine, there was a poor Raoul who overheard you." "This is the second time that you've listened behind the door, Monsieur de Charnier."
"This is the second time that I was not behind the door. I was in the dressing room, the inner room, mademoiselle."
"Oh, unhappy man!" groaned the girl, showing every sign of unspeakable terror. "Unhappy man, do you wish to be killed?"
"Perhaps."
Raoul uttered this perhaps with so much love and despair in his voice that Christine couldn't keep back a sob. She took his hands and looked at him with all the pure affection of which she was capable. Raoul, forget the man's voice and do not even remember its name. You must never try to fathom the mystery of the man's voice.
Is the mystery so very terrible?
There's no more awful mystery on this earth. Swear to me that you'll make no attempt to find out. Swear to me that you'll never come to my dressing room unless I send for you.
Then you promise to send for me sometimes, Christine?
I promise.
When?
Tomorrow.
Then I swear to do as you ask.
And at this he kissed her hands and went away, cursing Eric
and resolving to be patient.
Alright, folks. That's a chapter boundary, and we're close enough to 2 hours that I'm gonna call it an evening. Hey, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting. Oh wait, before I go, let's see how many chapters we have left. Let's go look. Let's look at the table of contents here. Oh, cool. The table of contents is not calibrated correctly for this ebook. Now I'm gonna have to Google it. Cool and good. Well, let's see what Google has to say. How many chapters are in the Phantom of the Opera? Are in Phantom of the Opera. Phantom of the Opera. It has, in total, 26 chapters plus an epilogue, and we're at chapter 11 now. So we have quite a few chapters remaining. So, anyway, for real this time, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.